Hey, it's Izzy Muda. So, if you don't know, I'm a product designer and I want to share a little story. About 6 months ago, I joined a project, a banking project, and I was given the opportunity to create a design system. Did I do it right? No, I did not. I made a lot of mistakes. But in this video, I want to give you a few tips and tricks and share my experience so you don't have to make the same mistakes that I did. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so for the purposes of this video, we're gonna look at Gojek's design system. Why? Because a few months ago I came across Uber's design system. If you don't know what it's called Base. I'm gonna include that in the link below. And I thought it was a really good example of how you should be setting up your design system and your design library. Unfortunately for us, or me I guess, Gojek doesn't actually release their library to the public. They do release their design system documentation, which is extremely helpful. It's a little bit outdated. Okay, so I was in bed last night getting ready to edit this video, and as it turns out, Gojek released footage or like a sneak peek of their new design system or their new UI. And now this whole video is kind of outdated. Don't worry, I'll update it in the future at some point, and like hopefully the lessons are still valuable to you. Okay, now onto the video that I hope you still find useful. But it was just enough to help me recreate their design library based off of what I found from Uber Base. Yes, I said way too many bases. But because I want you guys to know how to structure your design system, I've also included my rendition of Gojek's Asphalt in the description. So if you want to stop the video and download it or like load it up first, go ahead, I'll wait. Okay, so I'm gonna start off by saying we're doing everything in Figma, so if you have Figma, great. If you're trying to use Sketch, well, it's a bit different, and I haven't used Sketch in like a year, so I don't really know how it's gonna work for you, but maybe you can take away some of the key points that I'm gonna share with you. So before we get into this, I'm gonna start by just sharing briefly why. So this is based off of a post that I made on Instagram a few days ago. If you wanna check it out, go check it out. Muda Experience, for those of you that aren't following. But one of the main reasons you should have a design system, well, there are 4 main reasons. The first one is efficiency. Now, that just means if you have it set up properly, you can work faster. So developers and designers don't have to redesign everything, they can just plug and play. It's like my favorite toy from my childhood, which is Legos. Or, can you see this? This is Emmett from the Lego movie. Did you know that Legos from the 1950s are still compatible with Legos today? Now, what does that have to do with design systems? If you have a proper design system, it's always gonna work. It's always gonna fit. One of the other key reasons why you should have a design system is consistency. You'll have consistency across all your apps, across all your features within the app. The basic shape of Lego are these circular nubs and these circular nub holes. I'm not saying your design system should include a bunch of nubs, but if you design it to accommodate for shapes, if you start with a few base shapes, the consistency across the app will be seen and everything should be able to fit together nicely. Okay. The next thing is scale. Make it scale by making it easy to use. A lot of people can pick it up very fast, and your app should be able to grow without really much thought into how you should design things, because you should be able to just plug and play. Okay, I'm gonna rush through this. Oh yeah, and the last thing is the user. Why the user? Well, if everything's consistent and everything makes sense to them, they should not have to learn something new when they're using your app. They can just use it, recognize the shapes, recognize the interactions, and they get what they want done. And if they want to get something done, they're not hit with an error. You manage their expectations. Okay, so now we're done with why you should have one. We're going to talk about making it work. So if you've already reached the point where you're lucky enough to be in the process of creating one, you've got to make sure it works for your designers. I mean, it all sounds great, you know, it's going to help everyone, but if you don't know how to set it up, then you're pretty much going to get lost. Kind of how I felt. So now you don't have to feel lost the way I did. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to focus on setting up your design library. Design systems also can include, or they should also include documentation, and for the purposes of this video, I'm going to leave that out. So if you want to see documentation, I'll link the Asphalt design system and you can read up on how that's set up, but I'm not going to go through it. We're just going to focus on setting up the design system for now. I mean the design library. So the library, you got to make sure it's you got to make sure it's usable. You want operational excellence. You want people to be able to pick it up and go. Okay, so let's get into it. I've got 4 main rules. Unfortunately, I didn't follow these rules at the beginning, but I want you to, because you're going to need this. Otherwise, it's going to be really difficult for people to use it. You know, if you've got a team of 5, you can still manage if things are a bit of a mess. You got a team of 100, you're gonna spend a lot of time talking to people. Try not to spend all your time explaining where components are or explaining how to use them. The first is get your naming right. From what I've seen, there are basically 2 main naming structures that people use. There's atomic design system, or like an atomic structure, and then there's the component-based structure. Now, I actually studied chemical engineering, so you know, in theory, this would make more sense to me. But I mean, in theory, it sounds great. It does, but practically, it doesn't work. It lacks context. Let me explain to you how it is, and I guess you can decide whether you want to use it or not. I recommend to avoid it. So, an atomic structure, you start with a few base shapes, a few base styles, and you use those as your basic components to start building things. Now this part of it, I like. Make sure everything is based off of the same base styles and you have a system that's extremely compatible. But when you start naming things based off of these base styles, it gets a bit confusing, it gets a bit tricky. Because you'll have things that should appear in the same context that appear between your atoms or your molecules or your organisms, when really they should be in the same vertical and not split up by these different horizontals. I'll explain this a bit more later. Component-based structure is, you know, if you got a group of buttons, they're all called buttons. If you got a group of input fields, they're all called input fields. If you need to organize things based on their usage in a map, name them all map. It's very intuitive, it's very contextual, and it'll be a lot easier for people to pick up. So the next step is, if you've chosen a naming convention, how do you go about naming your things? I'm going to share with you how I've set up the way I've named things in this design document, or like in this design library. But again, this is just what I think is best. You're welcome to try your own naming convention. Like, it doesn't have to follow exactly, but this is a useful guideline or baseline for you. So we start with the component name. In this case, I'm just gonna talk about buttons because it's the easiest for me to pick out of my head. So if you got a group of buttons, start by calling it button. After that, you add the differentiator. Now, a differentiator could be a visual differentiator, like you've got round buttons or square buttons, or it could be a functional differentiator, like if you have a button specifically for payment, or you have a button specifically for checkout, for example. You can name it button, payment, and then continue. Okay. The next thing in line is class. Now, class refers to where it is in the hierarchy. So, is it primary, secondary, tertiary? And yeah, that's basically just where it belongs in the system. And the next thing you have is type. Now, type can be split up into multiple different classifiers. So you could have a large type, and then within those large types you have an icon type or a label type or an icon plus label type. This is just supposed to help your designer figure out what the component is like. You share the characteristics of it. And then lastly, you have the state or the variation, which I don't have a post-it for. State, enabled, active, disabled, just one of those, or yeah, one of those. You basically have all of that one component within the same parent, and then you can change the states at the very end. State should always be at the end. Now, when you're naming your things, you don't have to use all of these classifiers. You can just pick ones that you think are appropriate. It just depends on how many of a certain component you have. You only have one button throughout your whole app, well, then you just call it the button. If you have like 20 different buttons, like I have in this system, then you should start naming it different things, because otherwise it's going to get a bit confusing. Okay, now the next thing is structure. Structure becomes less important if you already have a really good naming system. You could keep everything on one page and it would be fine. Just make sure it's organized. This is more for you as someone that's supposed to manage the design system, or if you have a team member that's coming in and they want to see the whole thing and they want to understand the structure, or if you have devs going in and trying to find certain things, a structure is going to be really useful because it's going to be easy for them to find things, and it's just going to make your life a lot more peaceful when you don't have to deal with so many missing or like disorganized things. So for this library, or for this Asphalt library, I have a title card. This is really useful because in Figma, your title card is the thumbnail that shows up at the very beginning. So as you can see here, the Asphalt library, and then all the other things that I've designed, like my last video, the TikTok one. And then you have your components. So in this component, I've actually placed my base styles in here as well. And then below that, I have the components, and we'll get into that a bit later. Assets refer to all visual assets. So this is icons, illustrations, sprites. You know, in this Gojek app, you have car sprites. And last, I have annotations. Now, annotations, you add that in just so it's easy for everyone to, you know, if you need a post-it, if you need emojis, they're all sorted here. If you need to put it in a title, you know, keep everything consistent so that it's nice and easy for people to look through the Figma files. This is just, you know, you don't have to do this part, but it's fun, it's nice, why not? Again, this is just my recommendation based off of what I've learned and based off of what I've experienced. You don't have to follow. Your design system has to be kept alive. So what that means is it's constantly going to be updated as you start building out more features. You start discovering that you need new components and there are new interactions that you have to cater for. Well, have a way for everyone to be able to group together and talk about what their component does, and talk about new components and whether we can use them or whether we leave them out. I recommend once a week you meet up with your team, talk about whether there's new components. If there's nothing, you know, 5-minute meeting, just chat, just say hello. Like, hey, how's it going? Okay, and the fourth thing is documentation. Now, documentation I'm not going to talk about. You can search a bunch of different documentations for a bunch of different design systems. There's material. There's the, I think Apple's called human interaction guidelines. Gojek has Asphalt. You can look that up too. Uber has Base. You can also look that up, which is really useful. I think theirs are hosted by GitHub. Yeah, just have a look at that. Make your own. Make a system where you keep making your own, and it'll be useful for you and the team as you start to grow. Okay, so now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's look at this. I provide some context as to how this is set up, so when you're looking at it, you're not that confused. Now, I think before we get started, it'll be a good idea for you to download 2 plugins. One of them is Design System Organizer. It lets you manage your design system, so your color styles, your fonts, well, actually the components too, but the reason I like it is for the color style organization and the font organization, and I guess effects if you have a lot of those. And then because this is a ride-sharing app, you're going to need maps. The best that I've found for this case is Mapsicle. It lets you put maps into shapes. You can set your own maps. It's not completely accurate, but it gets the job done. I like it. Okay, so now we can get into the fun part of walking you through this. We start with our references. So I just took a bunch of references from Asphalt, from their website. And what I realized is that a lot of this is outdated. So Gojek is actually in the middle of transitioning their design system. They're keeping it alive, which is really cool. But yeah, so I had to find some colors. So in this design library that you're gonna see, let me just shrink this. You can see that I have all these different colors. Some of them come from the Asphalt documentation. Some others I just had to find myself because based off of screenshots that I took. So yeah, we have our color styles, we have our font styles, and then we have a bunch of screenshots that I use to base my components off of. So I'm going to delete these from the shared version because my address is in here and I don't want you guys to see it. With all these references, I was able to put together a system of components that you guys can now use. And we'll get into that system after we go through the color styles and the base styles. So, like always, start with your base styles. This will help keep consistency across your whole app. It'll help you build out your components off of these, and it's a really good way to do things. So we have our colors, they're all organized. We have our typography. Now, this list I just took off of Gojek's design system. I just took off of their documentation. They actually use different font for body and for numbers and also for buttons. This is quite common. I actually do this in my own design system. It's just based off of how much information you're trying to pack into a small space. So body has normal spacing, number. I can't remember now, but buttons are usually more compact so you can fit more in. So yeah, that's just a tip when you're setting things up. Next, we have shapes. Now, these shapes are important because all our components are based off of these shapes. Now, what that means is that, for example, I have this round button. If all of a sudden we want to change everything that's round into a square, I can go up here and change the corner radius, and then all those components, or like most of them, as long as they're not detached for some special case reason, they will end up becoming a square, which is pretty cool. Yeah, and then same case for all the other rounding. So I found 4 different corner radiuses in Asphalt. And yeah, you can set up as many as you like based on what you need. And now we have separators, so these separators are going to be common. They'll just be everywhere. We have modifiers as well. Now, You don't have to use modifiers, but I like using modifiers. They're used to signal the different type of states that exist within the app. So if you have a button with a press state, a lot of people like setting the color setting to something different. Here's a tip though. When you're designing for Android, there's like a basic animation where when you tap, the whole button turns dark. It's like this darkening circle. Usually developers will prefer to go with that, like for the speed of your execution and just for like what users are used to seeing. This works really well. So to portray that, I have this pressed overlay which the developers can set later. Okay, so that's modifiers, and we also have effects now. There are a lot more than 2 effects. Right now I only have an 8 dp and a 2 dp shadow. This just refers to how many pixels above the base background the shape is. So yeah, this is 2, this is 8. The shadow will differ depending on what you set. Or depending on the distance, sorry. Okay, so now that we have all our base styles, we can go into components. So I've organized the components into different frames. Now, the reason being, if you put components into a frame, they all adopt the name of this frame. So for example, if I change this button to something else, like if I decide to call it, we'll use this as an example. Gojek right now, they're in the middle of a design transition. So they have a specific design library for GoRide, or like they have specific components for GoRide and they have specific components for GoOther. If one day the systems are officially separated, then we can rename this whole frame into GoRide button, and then the next system for all the GoOthers, we can call it GoOther button, and it becomes really quick to manage because you can just name the frame. Also, if you want to move stuff around, that becomes easy too. So I have all my components within frames. This is a really good practice. In my own design system, I haven't set this up, and because of the way we've named things, it's a bit hard to do that now, so make sure you do this at the beginning. This is really helpful. And I've also named everything based off of this classifier structure that I've set up. Now, this is the one that I'm using. I recommend that you use it too. If you know a better way, please in the comments let me know. But yeah, if you want to take this example, we'll go ahead. We'll just walk through one because I think it'll be good to show you how it's set up. So if we look in the left-hand panel, we have round. So round is the visual differentiator. For a component, it's actually maintained in the frame name. So this will show up as button, and then it starts within these frames as visual differentiator. Okay, so we have button, that's the differentiator. The class is primary. And then the type is large and the state is enabled. The type is label, and the type is large and label, and then the state is enabled. Now, there's a small tip that I'm going to share with you about the class. So this button, for example, it's used to portray a primary action interaction. Now, there are cases where you have a pill and one of these primary buttons in the same page. In that case, the button should always be the primary. A pill should never be primary in this situation. Let me show you an example. So for pills, I have these 3 types of pills. They're all like the first level of, they're like all the first class of pills. However, their purpose within the app is never going to actually be primary. So the highest level pill will have the name secondary, and then the secondary level pill will have the name tertiary, as you can see in my left-hand panel. So yeah, that's just a tip. Don't call something that's should be primary, because when designers go to look for it, they'll think it's primary, and then they'll use it as a primary, and we don't want that. So do your best to avoid that. So yeah, that's just the structure that we have. Just as another example, we have this primary square button. The difference between all the components on the other side is that this is called square and the ones on the left are called round. So when a designer goes into, actually let's just show an example of this. So when a designer goes in to change the instance, they can either set the state to disabled or pressed. Oh, whoops, I've got those messed up. I'll fix that before I share this. But anyway, if the designer wants to go in and change the component, they can see that, oh yeah, this is a button. Okay, now I have this square button. I actually want to change it to a different type of button. I can change it to round or promotional, or I can change it to a pill or payment or circle. In our case, we're going to change it to round, so I need a primary round button. So okay, we got primary. Now I need a large one, so I'm going to find a large one, and then we have all these different options of the type. So we can have a label or an icon trailing, and let's say I want to add an icon to my button, so I go, okay, I want a leading one, and what state is it? Enabled, disabled, pressed. I'm going to go with enabled. So there we go. Also, another issue with Figma is that you're limited to like 5 different levels of naming, so just be a bit careful when you name things. Okay, yeah, so the same thing goes for input, same thing goes for steppers. You can go in and discover all this yourself. And now we'll go into assets. Now, you're probably wondering how I got all these references. Like again, we start with the references. These references actually came from the Gojek APK. So if you don't know what that is, it's the app file. I downloaded it, I extracted it, and I took all their images. I mean, you can do this. I don't know the level of like legality of this. If I'm not supposed to do this, I'm sorry, but it was there, so I took it. So yeah, so we have all these reference icons. Of course, I'm not going to use all of these, since a lot of them are outdated. You have to sort through them and find the right ones. But it was useful for getting the sprites. It was useful for getting the illustrations and a few other icons. Another way you can get icons is go into their website, or like go into a website, and then you can download the icons that are used in the website, because usually if you're using a design system, they'll have the same components on the website as they have in the app. So as we can see here, I've structured it icons, there are sprites, there are indicators, and there's identity. Icons are just general icons, like you know what icons are. You can see them here. We have these icon markers, we have these other icons. Now these are PNGs, that's why they're so big. Typically I like to set everything 24 by 24, as you can see here. But in some cases they'll be larger. You just have to maintain it when you build your components later on. And we have these sprites. Indicators, it's nice to make a component for your indicators, because then if you change the colors or if you change the style later on, you can adjust it here and it'll change without the whole app. Okay, now identity. In this case, I only took the Gojek like official logo, but you can see how this would be filled with a list of other logos. So put your logos all here, put your identity, all your branding assets here, and then you can just grab them later when you're designing. And then we have all these illustrations. They'll all have their own use case, but I've just put them here in case you want to use them for something. Okay, and I guess that's the Asphalt library. Now, I've made this available to you, so if you want to download it, just go straight into the description. Let me know what you thought. If you also make design systems or work in design systems, let me know. Give me input. I also would like to learn from people working on making design systems. So yeah, just share your thoughts. And I guess I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for joining me. Don't forget to subscribe and like and comment, please. And if you're wondering why I'm wearing a different shirt, it's just I shot the other video yesterday because I have a full-time job and it just takes up a lot of time some days, so I have to record in separation. But I'm here.